Late 1944. A lone American fighter struggled through the sky over Europe, trailing smoke and barely holding altitude as it turned back toward friendly territory. The aircraft had already taken multiple hits during a mission. Its wings were torn, sections of its fuselage were damaged, and one part of the tail showed clear signs of impact. Under normal circumstances, a fighter in this condition would not have remained in the air for long. Most aircraft, once critically damaged, lost control quickly or broke apart under stress. But this machine was still flying. Inside the cockpit, the pilot focused on keeping the aircraft steady, adjusting controls that no longer responded as smoothly as before. The engine, despite the damage, continued running. The aircraft was the P-47 Thunderbolt, and situations like this were becoming more common than anyone had expected. Planes that should have been lost were returning. Pilots who should not have survived were landing back at base. The aircraft was beginning to earn a reputation for something unusual. Not speed, not agility, but the ability to take punishment and keep flying. What made these moments even more surprising was how often they were repeated. Reports began spreading among Allied squadrons about Thunderbolts returning with damage that seemed impossible for a fighter to survive. Some aircraft came back with large sections of their wings missing. Others showed bullet holes across their fuselage and tail, evidence of heavy defensive fire from the ground or enemy aircraft. In many cases, pilots described situations where they expected the aircraft to fail at any moment, only to find that it continued flying long enough to bring them home. This created a different kind of confidence among the men flying it. The P-47 was not simply another fighter. It was becoming a machine that could absorb damage and still complete its mission. Yet, this strength was not an accident. It was the result of a design that had taken a different approach to building a fighter aircraft. While many fighters focused on being light and agile, the Thunderbolt had been built with power, protection, and durability in mind. And as the war intensified, those qualities would begin to matter more than ever. Because in a battlefield filled with anti-aircraft fire, enemy fighters, and dangerous missions at low altitude, my survival was not just about skill. It was about whether the aircraft could take the hit and still bring the pilot back alive. In the early years of World War II, fighter pilots understood one rule better than anything else. A fighter aircraft could not take much damage and stay in the air. Most fighters were designed to be light, fast, and maneuverable. Engineers reduced weight wherever possible to improve speed and turning ability, which meant less armor and less structural reinforcement. Aircraft such as the Spitfire, Bf-109, and even many American fighters depended on agility and performance rather than protection. In combat, a few well-placed rounds from machine guns or cannon fire could quickly disable critical systems. Fuel lines could rupture, control cables could snap, and engines could fail within seconds. Pilots were trained to avoid being hit at all costs, because once an aircraft took serious damage, survival often depended on abandoning the plane. The parachutes were not just a backup. They were an expectation. The assumption was clear. If a fighter was hit hard enough, it would not make it back. This understanding shaped how pilots approached every mission. Air combat was not only about attacking the enemy, but also about avoiding situations where the aircraft could take sustained fire. Pilots relied on speed, positioning, and surprise to stay alive. Entering a heavily defended area or flying through concentrated anti-aircraft fire was considered extremely dangerous because even a short burst could be enough to destroy the aircraft. Escort missions, ground attacks, and low-altitude operations were especially risky because they exposed fighters to both enemy aircraft and defensive fire from the ground. In these conditions, pilots expected that if their aircraft was hit multiple times, it would likely not survive the encounter. That belief was reinforced by experience. Many pilots saw fellow aircraft go down after taking damage that seemed relatively minor. A damaged wing, A hit to the engine or a few rounds through the fuselage could quickly turn a controlled flight into a fatal situation. This was the reality of fighter aviation at the time. Aircraft were not built to absorb punishment. They were built to avoid it. And it was within this environment that the P-47 Thunderbolt began to change what pilots believed a fighter aircraft could survive. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not designed to follow the same philosophy as many other fighters of its time. While most aircraft focused on reducing weight to increase speed and maneuverability, the Thunderbolt took a different approach. It was built around power, strength, and the ability to survive damage. At the heart of the aircraft was a massive Pratt and Whitney R2800 radial engine, one of the most powerful piston engines used during the war. This engine was not only capable of producing high levels of power, but also had an advantage over inline engines used in many other fighters. Its radial design meant that even if part of the engine was damaged, it could sometimes continue running. Surrounding this engine was a strong airframe built to handle both high-speed dives and combat stress. The aircraft's large size, though which initially made some pilots question its agility, actually contributed to its durability. Thick wings, a reinforced fuselage, and internal systems designed with protection in mind gave the Thunderbolt a structure that could absorb damage far better than many lighter fighters. In addition to its strong airframe, the P-47 was equipped with features that increased its chances of survival during combat. Armor plating was installed around critical areas, such as the cockpit, helping to protect the pilot from incoming fire. Self-sealing fuel tanks reduced the risk of fire if the aircraft was hit, a major advantage during engagements with both enemy fighters and ground-based anti-aircraft weapons. The aircraft also carried 8.50 caliber machine guns, giving it heavy firepower that allowed pilots to engage targets effectively without needing prolonged exposure to enemy fire. Its turbo supercharger system allowed it to maintain strong performance at high altitude, while its weight and structure made it exceptionally stable during high-speed dives. These characteristics combined to create an aircraft that did not rely solely on avoiding damage, but could withstand it when necessary. What initially appeared to be a large and heavy fighter turned out to be something very different, a machine built to survive in conditions where other aircraft might fail. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not just designed to fight, it was designed to endure, and that distinction would soon become one of its most important strengths in the air war. The true measure of the P-47 Thunderbolt came not from its design specifications, but from what happened when it faced real combat conditions. As Allied air operations expanded over Europe, Thunderbolt pilots were sent on missions that exposed them to intense enemy fire. Escort missions required them to fly alongside bomber formations deep into contested airspace, while ground attack operations forced them to descend to low altitudes where anti-aircraft guns were most dangerous. In these environments, aircraft were frequently hit. What surprised many observers was not that Thunderbolts were taking damage, but that they were returning from missions despite it. Reports began circulating among squadrons describing aircraft that had sustained heavy fire, yet managed to stay in the air long enough to bring their pilots back to base. In some cases, the damage was clearly visible even before landing. Wings showed holes from machine gun fire, sections of the fuselage were torn or dented, and parts of the tail structure appeared compromised. Under normal expectations, aircraft in this condition would not have remained controllable. These encounters provided the first real proof that the Thunderbolt's design had practical advantages in combat. The aircraft's strong structure allowed it to absorb damage without immediately losing integrity, while its radial engine could continue operating even after sustaining hits. Pilots began describing situations where they expected engine failure or loss of control, only to find that the aircraft continued flying. During low-altitude missions, where anti-aircraft fire was especially concentrated, this durability became even more important. The ability to withstand damage meant that pilots had a greater chance of completing their mission and returning safely, even after being hit multiple times. These early combat experiences changed how the aircraft was perceived. What had initially seemed like a heavy and unconventional fighter began to be recognized as a machine built for survival in harsh conditions. The P-47 was no longer judged solely by its speed or maneuverability, but by its ability to keep flying when other aircraft might have been lost. Each damaged Thunderbolt that returned to base reinforced the same conclusion. The aircraft's strength was not theoretical. It was proven in the realities of combat. For the pilots who flew the P-47 Thunderbolt, the aircraft's strength was not just a technical feature. It became something they relied on in moments where survival was uncertain. Combat missions often placed pilots in situations where decisions had to be made quickly, and there was little margin for error. During escort operations, Thunderbolt pilots flew alongside heavy bombers for long distances, knowing that enemy fighters could appear at any time. In ground attack roles, they descended into environments filled with anti-aircraft fire, where even a brief pass over a target could expose them to concentrated fire from multiple directions. In these conditions, pilots did not expect to avoid every hit. Instead, they began to trust that their aircraft could withstand damage long enough for them to complete the mission and return. This shift in mindset was significant. Rather than focusing entirely on avoiding danger, pilots could operate with the understanding that their aircraft offered a level of protection that was not common among fighters of the time. Accounts from Thunderbolt pilots often reflected this growing confidence. Many described moments where their aircraft had been hit repeatedly, yet continued to respond to controls and maintain enough power to stay airborne. In some cases, pilots reported hearing impacts against the fuselage or wings and preparing for the worst, only to realize that the aircraft was still flying. This experience created a different kind of connection between pilot and machine. The P-47 was no longer just a tool for combat. It became something that pilots depended on when situations turned dangerous. And this trust influenced how missions were carried out. Pilots were more willing to engage in difficult operations, including low-altitude attacks against heavily defended targets, because they believed their aircraft could handle the risk. Over time, this confidence contributed to the Thunderbolt's reputation as a reliable and durable fighter. It was not just capable of performing in combat. It gave pilots a better chance of surviving it. In a war where many factors were beyond a pilot's control, the ability to rely on the strength of their aircraft became one of the most important advantages they had. As more combat reports confirmed the durability of the P-47 Thunderbolt, its role in the war began to evolve. Early in its service, the aircraft had primarily been used as a high-altitude escort fighter, supporting bomber formations over long distances. In that role, its turbo-supercharged engine allowed it to perform effectively at high altitude, where many engagements with enemy fighters took place. However, as the war progressed and new long-range fighters like the P-51 Mustang took over much of the escort responsibility, the Thunderbolt was increasingly assigned to a different type of mission, one that would place even greater demands on its strength. Commanders began to recognize that the aircraft's durability made it well-suited for ground attack operations, where fighters had to operate at low altitude and face intense anti-aircraft fire. These missions involved attacking enemy vehicles, supply lines, and defensive positions, often requiring repeated passes over heavily defended targets. This shift changed how the Thunderbolt was used and how it was perceived. Instead of avoiding dangerous areas, P-47 pilots were now deliberately entering them. Flying low over enemy territory exposed the aircraft to machine gun fire, anti-aircraft cannons, and other ground-based defenses that could damage or destroy lighter fighters. Yet the Thunderbolt's strong airframe and protective features allowed it to survive in these conditions more effectively than many other aircraft. Pilots could approach targets, deliver their attacks, and still have a reasonable chance of returning even after taking hits. The aircraft's heavy armament also played a key role in this new mission profile. With 8.50 caliber machine guns, the P-47 could deliver powerful strafing runs against ground targets, making it an effective tool for disrupting enemy operations. Over time, this combination of firepower and durability turned the Thunderbolt into one of the most effective ground attack fighters of the war. The aircraft was no longer defined by a single role. It had adapted to meet the demands of a changing battlefield, proving that its strength was not just in surviving damage, but in enabling missions that required both resilience and sustained combat performance. As the role of the P-47 Thunderbolt expanded, its impact on the battlefield grew not only because of its design, but because of the scale at which it was produced and deployed. The United States had the industrial capacity to manufacture large numbers of aircraft, and the Thunderbolt became one of the key fighters produced during the war. Factories operated continuously, assembling aircraft that would be sent to multiple theaters of operation across Europe and beyond. This meant that the qualities that defined the P-47, its durability, firepower, and ability to survive damage, were not limited to a small number of units. Instead, they were multiplied across entire squadrons and groups, creating a consistent presence in the air over contested regions. Wherever Allied forces advanced, Thunderbolts were often part of the operations, supporting both air and ground missions. This widespread deployment amplified the aircraft's effectiveness. In ground attack roles, groups of P-47s could operate together, striking supply lines, transportation routes, and defensive positions repeatedly. Their ability to survive damage meant that losses were lower than they might have been with more fragile aircraft, allowing squadrons to maintain operational strength over time. This consistency made a difference in sustained campaigns, where repeated missions were necessary to weaken enemy infrastructure and support advancing ground forces. The Thunderbolt's presence became a regular part of Allied operations, and its reliability contributed to mission planning. The commanders could assign tasks knowing that the aircraft was capable of performing under difficult conditions and returning from missions where other fighters might not. Over time, this combination of industrial scale and battlefield durability reinforced the Thunderbolt's role as a dependable and effective aircraft. It was not just a fighter that could survive individual encounters. It was part of a larger system that used production, deployment, and resilience together to maintain pressure on the enemy throughout the course of the war. As the P-47 Thunderbolt appeared more frequently over European battlefields, German pilots and ground crews began to form a clearer understanding of what they were facing. Early encounters may have focused on the aircraft's size and shape, which made it stand out compared to more streamlined fighters. However, repeated combat experiences shifted attention away from its appearance and toward its behavior under fire. Reports from engagements increasingly noted that Thunderbolts did not respond to damage in the same way as many other aircraft. Fighters that would normally break apart, lose control, or catch fire after sustaining hits were being replaced by aircraft that continued flying despite visible damage. This observation became more significant during both air combat and ground attack missions, where the P-47 was often exposed to sustained fire. German pilots engaging these aircraft found that inflicting damage did not always produce the expected result. The Thunderbolt might slow down, lose some performance, or show signs of structural stress, but it often remained in the air long enough to withdraw from the fight. This realization affected how the aircraft was approached in combat. Instead of assuming that a few successful hits would disable the target, pilots had to account for the possibility that the P-47 could absorb damage and continue operating. In ground-based defenses, where anti-aircraft units relied on concentrated fire to bring down attacking aircraft, the Thunderbolt's resilience also became noticeable. Aircraft returning to Allied bases with extensive damage demonstrated that the usual expectations for combat outcomes did not always apply. Over time, this led to a more cautious understanding of the Thunderbolt as an opponent. It was not simply another fighter to be engaged and quickly neutralized. It was an aircraft that could endure conditions that would normally result in losses. This did not make it invulnerable, but it did change how it was perceived within the broader context of the air war. The P-47 had established itself as a machine that could take punishment and still remain operational, and that characteristic alone made it a more challenging and unpredictable presence in combat situations. By the later stages of the war, the P-47 Thunderbolt had proven that durability was not just a technical advantage, it was a strategic one. In a conflict where aircraft were constantly exposed to enemy fire, the ability to survive damage directly affected how often missions could be completed and how many pilots could return to fly again. Every time a Thunderbolt came back with heavy damage, it meant one more experienced pilot remained in service. Over time, this had a cumulative effect. Pilots gained more combat experience, squadrons maintained their strength, and missions could continue without the same level of replacement required by units flying more fragile aircraft. This consistency became increasingly important as Allied operations intensified across Europe. Ground forces depended on air support to disrupt enemy movement, or destroy supply lines, and weaken defensive positions. The Thunderbolt's ability to perform these tasks repeatedly, even under heavy fire, made it a reliable part of the system. At the same time, the aircraft's durability allowed it to operate in roles that might have been too risky for other fighters. Low-altitude attacks against vehicles, rail lines, and defensive installations required pilots to fly directly into areas protected by anti-aircraft guns. These missions carried a high level of danger, but the Thunderbolt's design gave pilots a better chance of surviving them. As a result, the aircraft became an important tool in supporting the broader Allied strategy of applying constant pressure on enemy forces. This pressure was not created by a single mission or a single aircraft, but by repeated operations carried out over time. The P-47's ability to endure damage ensured that it could continue contributing to these efforts without being removed from service after every engagement. In this way, the Thunderbolt demonstrated that survivability could influence the outcome of a campaign just as much as speed or firepower. It was not the fastest or most agile fighter in every situation, but it played a role that was equally important, helping to ensure that missions were completed and that pilots had a greater chance of returning to fight again. The P-47 Thunderbolt proved that survival could be just as powerful as speed or agility in air combat. While other fighters relied on avoiding damage, the Thunderbolt showed that enduring it could change how missions were fought and won. In a war filled with danger at every altitude, it became a machine that didn't just fight, it brought pilots back home.